The enslavement of human beings occupies a painful and tragic space in world history. Denying a person's freedom, autonomy, and life represent the worst kind of abuse of human rights. Many societies tolerated and condoned human slavery for centuries, but in the 15th century, an expanded and terrifying new era of enslavement emerged that has had a proven and devastating impact on human history. After discovering lands that had been occupied by indigenous people for centuries, European powers sent ships and armed militia to exploit these new lands for wealth and profit starting in the 1400s. In territories we now call the Americas, gold, sugar, tobacco, and extraordinary natural resources were viewed as opportunities to gain power and influence for Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Scandinavian nations. Europeans first sought to enslave the indigenous people who occupied these lands to create wealth for foreign powers, resulting in a catastrophic genocide. Disease, famine, and conflict killed millions of native people within a relatively short period of time. Determined to extract wealth from this distant land, European powers sought laborers from Africa, launching a tragic era of kidnapping, abduction, and trafficking that resulted in the enslavement of millions of African people. The transatlantic slave trade was a tragic and horrific chapter in history. It was a time when millions of Africa were forcibly taken from their homes and transported to distant lands, primarily to the Americas. This trade began in the 15th century and continued for over 300 years, with devastating effects on African societies. Slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans' arrival. However, their demand for slave labor was so great that traders and their agents searched far inland, devastating the region. Powerful African leaders fueled the practice by exchanging enslaved people for goods such as alcohol, beads, and clothes. Europe had no contact with sub-Saharan Africa before the Portuguese, seeking wealth and goods, sailed down the western coast of Africa and reached the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, in 1471. Initially focused on obtaining gold, Portugal established trading relationships and built Elmina Fort to protect its interest in the gold trade. Over the following decades, the Spanish, English, French, Dutch, Danish, and Swedish began to make contact with sub-Saharan Africa as well. Portugal soon converted Elmina into a prison for holding kidnapped Africans, and European traffickers built castles, barracks, and forts on the African coast to support the forced enslavement of abducted Africans. German and Italian merchants and bankers, who did not personally traffic kidnapped Africans, nonetheless provided essential fundings and insurance to develop the transatlantic slave trade and plantation economy. Italian merchants were essential in the effort to extend the sugar plantation system to the Atlantic island off the west coast of Africa, like Sao Tome, and financial capitals from Genoa was instrumental in expanding Portugal's ability to traffic Africans. By the 1600s, every major European power had established trading relationships with sub-Saharan Africa and was participating in the transportation of kidnapped Africans to the Americas in some way. During this period, several thousand Africans were kidnapped and trafficked to mainland Europe and the Americas, but the volume of human trafficking soon escalated to horrific proportions. Around 12 million Africans were enslaved in the course of transatlantic slave trade between 1640 and 1807. British ships transported about 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic. The journey that enslaved Africans took across the Atlantic Ocean is known as the Middle Passage. It was a brutal and inhumane journey that could last for weeks or even months. Enslaved people were crammed into ships, often chained together in tight dark spaces below deck. They had little food and water, and diseases spread quickly. Many did not survive the journey. Historians estimate that from 50 to 25% of the millions of Africans forced into the Middle Passage across the Atlantic died due to the rough conditions on slave ships. Those who arrived at various ports in the Americas were then sold in public auctions or smaller trading venues to plantation owners, merchants, small farmers, prosperous tradesmen, and other slave traders. These traders could then transport slaves many miles further to sell on other Caribbean islands or into the North or South American interior. Predominantly, European slaveholders purchased enslaved Africans to provide labor that included domestic service and artisanal trades. The majority, however, provided agricultural labor and skills to produce plantation cash crops for national and international markets. Occasionally, the African captives successfully revolted and took over the ships. The most famous such incident occurred in 1839 when an enslaved African named Joseph Sink led a mutiny on the Spanish slave ship Amistad, killing the captain and 2 members of the crew. The ship was intercepted off New York State. An 1841 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court freed the Amistad rebels. Many of the enslaved people were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. In fact, a section of the African coast in what are now the countries of Togo, Benin, and Nigeria became known as the Slave Coast. Many more enslaved people were taken from West Central Africa, centered on the Portuguese colony in what is now Angola. A smaller number came from Portuguese-controlled parts of southeastern Africa. The transatlantic slave trade had specific ports where enslaved people were bought and sold. In Africa, places like El Mena in present-day Ghana, Gori Island in Senegal, and Luanda in Angola were major slave trading centers. In the Americas, ports like Charleston, South Carolina, Havana, Cuba, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil were key destinations for slave ships. In Europe, ports like Liverpool and Lisbon were part of the trading network, handling the logistics and profits from the trade. The transatlantic slave trade was abolished at different times by various countries involved in the trade. Denmark and Norway abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1803, with the ban taking effect in 1804. The United Kingdom followed in 1807 with the Slave Trade Act, though slavery continued in British colony until 1833. The United States also passed a similar act in 1807, effective from January 1, 1808, but slavery wasn't abolished until 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Sweden banned the trade in 1813, and the Netherlands did so in 1814, but slavery continued in Dutch colonies until 1863. France ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1818 and officially abolished slavery in 1848. Spain enacted legislation in 1820 but faced enforcement issues, with slave trading persisting in some Spanish colonies until the late 19th century. Portugal signed an agreement with the United Kingdom to limit the trade in 1815, but fully abolished it in 1836, with illegal trading continuing into the 1860s. The transatlantic slave trade led to the dispersion of millions of Africans across the Americas. An estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported during the slave trade, with approximately 10.7 million surviving the Middle Passage. In the United States, about 1.5 million Africans arrived during the trade, resulting in over 40 million African Americans today. Brazil, which received about 4.9 million enslaved Africans, now has over 100 million Afro-Brazilians. In the Caribbean, countries like Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba are home to millions of Afro-Caribbean people. South American nations like Colombia and Venezuela also have significant African descendant populations. with Colombia hosting about 4.7 million Afro-Colombians and Venezuela having a notably Afro-Venezuelan community. This figure shows the extensive African diaspora across the Americas and the proven impact of this transatlantic slave trade on the region's demographics and cultures. The transatlantic slave trade had devastating effects on African society. Entire communities were torn apart as families were separated. Many African cultures lost their skilled craftsmen, farmers, and leaders. The constant threat of slave raids created fear and instability across many regions in Africa. Beyond Africa, the slave trade impact is still felt today. The descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas have a unique history, marked by struggles for freedom and civil rights. The legacy of slavery has influenced music, arts, and religion, and even cuisine in places where enslaved Africans were taken. Overall, the transatlantic slave trade was a painful and dark period that left a lasting mark on history.